Four-dimensional chess in politics is a variant of the Boromir strategy, hence always evil. Bruce Charlton. Recent and forthcoming events in relation to the US president elections have once again filled the mass media and blogosphere with complex, labile, incoherent four-dimensional chess explanations of what is really going on. We know that the official story is never true. Nonetheless, it's a snare to get drawn into these attempts to discover the real truth. Not only because they are necessarily false explanations, although the truth is that we cannot ever know, because some key relevant information is unavailable to outsiders, and the insiders are all evil liars. And not only because even if the truth was discovered, and the villains and their villainy identified, justice would not be done. I fully accept that there are indeed many people playing 4D chess in politics, that is, adopting multi-layered strategies whereby the meaning of a move on one level may, or may not, mean the opposite, on another level, and where the overall strategy is only apparent by a multi-level, and dynamic awareness. And of course, other people, and probably most of them, are merely using 4D chess explanations to cover up incompetence, ignorance and insanity. But complex and long-term four-dimensional chess strategizing is how many of the leadership class operate, as I know from my own experiences working inside large bureaucracies, such as the National Health Service, universities, think tanks and the like. They discuss and make such plans, and they try to accomplish them. The 4D strategies are always derailed by endemic dishonesty, incompetence, and corruption. They invariably end by having different outcomes from intended, and by destroying capability and efficiency. Nonetheless, there are many such plans in the pipeline and operative. What I am saying is that reasoning about politics on the lines of 4D chess demonstrates that participants in this kind of strategy and analysis are on the side of evil. In other words, regarding politics as any kind of four-dimensional chess problem is an evil stance on human society, because it derives from a perspective on other people that is deceptive and manipulative. Typically, complex schemes of deception and manipulation are presented as being in a good cause, for example to defeat some evil, or in order that we, the supposedly good side, can win, and then do good things. In short, four-dimensional chess is a version of our old friend the Boromir strategy, which is an ancient demonic temptation to encourage a moral separation between ends and means, to encourage the delusion that we can pursue good ends by evil means. By contrast, when good is genuinely being pursued in politics, a rare situation, and currently absent, then means and ends are in obvious, upfront harmony, because both are clear and simple, and fit together. That's the only way that good is ever achieved in a top-down fashion. Christianity is pure choice, with no compulsion. Bruce Charlton. Christianity, properly grasped, and I personally fail in this all too often, is pure choice. There is no compulsion, because we can affiliate with God only voluntarily, as love must always be voluntary, else it is not love. So there is no compulsion to join with God in His creation, only the natural consequences that flow from our choices. Many people over the past 2+ centuries have rejected Christianity outright, because they experienced and regarded it as necessarily a package of choices mandatorily backed by coercive compulsions. While this rejection may merely be an excuse for sinning, rejection has been felt most deeply by those of romantic disposition, those who felt and valued their freedom, their creativity, and personal love, and who intuitively opposed any attempt at external compulsion, whether of motivation, thinking, feelings, purpose. They rejected the reality of the Christian understanding of God as a personal creator, because they could not believe that any loving person would relate to us as an absolute tyrant demanding obedience or else. Thus they rejected, variously, the Christian reality of God and creation, choosing instead determinism, the personal nature of God, choosing instead abstraction, or the goodness of God, choosing instead power to satisfy need or pleasure. We, here and now, need to ignore centuries of misrepresentation and manipulation, dig down to the root of reality, and recognize that the essence of Christianity is, and always has been, the opportunity to choose or not to affiliate ourselves with God's creative will, in heavenly life eternal. If you don't want it, then just walk away. We Christians ought not to try and stop you. What we can and should try to do, especially if we love you, is clarify just what is on offer when Jesus made possible resurrection. That isn't easy, and is impossible unless you want to know, and will therefore, really, listen. But if resurrection and the eternal life of loving creation really is not for you, if your preferences lie elsewhere, then that's that. It's your decision. That's what you need to grasp. You cannot avoid it, you have not avoided it. Either you make this decision yourself, else you instead decide to let someone else, or something else, make the decision for you. And if you make the choice on the basis of what I would regard as too little thought or a lazy failure of imagination, then it was your choice to behave thus. From my Christian perspective, the choice is, ultimately, inescapable, because it comes to everyone after death, if not before, the choice of yes or no to joining your purposes with God's. Forget about compulsion, if you can, set it aside. Think of it as pure choice, as purely your choice. Outsourcing understanding, what explains mass devotion to ethical abstractions, such as economic equality or the environment. Bruce Charlton. It has been statistically normal for so many generations that the mass of people have some kind of principled, ethical devotion to an abstraction, that the extreme strangeness of it gets unnoticed. An early form was Marxism/communism, which asked people to devote their lives, even sacrifice their lives, to the almost mathematical abstraction of global economic equality. And, in vast numbers they did. Yet how very weird it is that modern people who naturally and firmly believe that the universe has no purpose or meaning but happened by accidents, and that life and men evolved by the blind workings of natural selection, should care strongly about the abstraction of economic equality, or justice. Something that can only be measured by research and which concerns remote strangers, of whose existence they know only vaguely by unreliable report. The particular abstraction about which the masses, mostly, care varies through time, almost arbitrarily, and indeed people and institutions may profess several or many abstract principles, regardless of whether these cohere or contradict. Nowadays, the analogous ethical concern to Marxism is with that abstraction called the environment, and in particular with abstractions to do with supposed concentrations of carbon dioxide, and theories and data to do with its generation and effect on the abstraction of global climate. So we have the phenomenon of people who argue strenuously that they are themselves merely higher animals or naked apes, whose lives have no relevance or relation to the universe, and that everything which exists does so because of physics. And yet these same people regard it as an urgent moral imperative that they themselves, and everybody else, and indeed every living being on the planet, be organized and regulated in order to maintain a certain average global temperature, because that is best for the Earth. The big unasked question is, from whence cometh this moral imperative? Why should creature of the kind modern people assume themselves to be, and living in such a pointless and indifferent reality as modern people assume the universe to be, express, and sometimes live by, the conviction that we have a moral duty towards abstractions as communism or 21st century environmentalism? This is surely a bizarre combination. In the first place, why do people feel a binding morality for anything at all? But secondly, why for such remote abstractions? It has often been observed that many of those who care for the people are indifferent or actively cruel to actual human beings around them, and that a passionate devotion to the environment has led to gross destruction of nature, and its replacement with technology, in and around the same people's actual homes and workplaces. There is no explicit and coherent answer, and there can be none. This bizarre situation must arise from unacknowledged and implicit causes, not from acknowledged fundamental beliefs. The fact that people regard themselves as moral, and live in pursuit of these abstract moral abstractions, suggests that there is a deep but denied basis for morality at work unconsciously and invisibly. My best guess is that it is exactly because the basis for our actual mass morality is inexplicit, unconscious and denied. And this second-hand nature of values also explains the fact that the actual mass morality is highly arbitrary and unstable, and reactive rather than innate. Public morality changes in line with the perceived needs of the ruling authorities, and when these needs change, morality changes. The mass of people have simply got used to living with the mismatch between mandatory and aggressive superficial abstract moral beliefs on one hand, and on the other, an explicit and supposedly science-based rejection of any basis for such beliefs. To assert that one can have a meaningful and purposive personal life in a random and undirected universe of determined or selfish entities, is something that is so general as to seem like common sense. This situation has been building up for a couple of centuries, and the tacit assumption is that therefore it doesn't really matter. Even though people don't understand why they should care about the survival and equality of the human species, or the survival and temperature of the planet. In particular, people don't have any understanding of why they should care more for these remote second-hand abstractions than they care about the people and life around them. But a vital part of this modern worldview is that understanding is itself outsourced. In other words, people have become used to the idea that other people, experts and the like, will do their understanding for them. That, after all, is what churches have mostly told the masses for centuries, millennia. And that is the basis of the division of labor that underlies modern industrial society. To live one's morality and get one's strongest values amidst incomprehension, incoherence and even stark contradiction, is therefore regarded as just another component of the modern human condition. Very few are immune to this socially endorsed habit of outsourcing values, as can be seen by the willingness of so many Christians to accept incomprehension/incoherence/contradiction as articles of faith. And thereby not only to take their faith second-hand, and to prize institutional/social loyalty and obedience as their highest religious value, but to regard this delegation of responsibility for life itself as necessary, as well as sufficient, to being a Christian. No man is an island, not even if he uses Linux on his home computer. Prepping as psychotherapy. Bruce Charlton. The smug to the point of self-blinded idiocy of the dissident right was on display in spades last week, with respect to the global computer shutdown. We, especially in the West, live in the most interconnected and outsourced society the world has ever known by far. What happens to the system therefore happens to everyone, sooner or not very much later. The notion that individuals or small groups can separate themselves from any general collapse is risible. Therefore, the fact that someone, or some company or institution, was able to avoid direct harm when the world computer system shut down for several hours is irrelevant. What is on view here is that the ideal of prepping is no more significant than any other form of self-psychotherapy. It may make you feel safe and smug and superior for a few hours or days, but that is its only significance. Spiritual activism versus lifestyle hacks. Bruce Charlton. I think there is too often a self-gratifying conflation at work when individuals are, implicitly, bragging about their lifestyle hacks that are, after all is said and done, ultimately rooted in the same value system as the mainstream leftist ideology, in other words, hedonic utilitarianism. The conflation occurs when it is stated or implied that such activities constitute a program of resistance and reform directed against the evil system of our Western world and towards the positive construction of a better alternative world. My criticism is that, while pretending to spiritual Christian significance, such discourse is actually being held at the level of selfish, worldly goals, tips for living a safer and more comfortable life for me and mine, with the political spectrum mostly being about who qualifies as mine. People naturally seek ways to combine what is good for my personal enjoyment with what is good for civilization, but I believe that there is a near-zero link between these when it comes to positive good. I mean by the limitation on positive good that our personal material lifestyle choices can much more powerfully make things worse at a large scale than they can have a positive benefit. We are more likely to do general harm than net good, and that harm is likely to be greater. This is probably due to a combination of the entropic nature of this world, and the current, unprecedented, degree of dominance by demonic evil. When I come across people expounding the worldly wisdom of lifestyle hacks as if these were a program for the good Christian, it is my strong impression that this confusion and false connection is a consequence of failing to realize the depth and breadth of the problem, especially as it affects the West. Anyone who thinks that their hacks, tips, and social or business schemes are addressing the problem is living in a state of self-gratifying delusion, or maybe trying to manipulate and exploit us for their own goals, whether consciously or not. Therefore, while I don't think we ought always to be harping on about the problem, i.e. the scale, scope, breadth and depth of pervasive evil in our world, and neither should we be brooding upon it continually, it nonetheless seems obvious that this awareness must be our starting point. A Christian can only orientate himself correctly in the world, from a situation in which he recognizes the pervasive normalization of extreme evil. This recognition reveals that our personal level material lifestyle choices are all but powerless to have a positive effect on things in general. More to the point, lifestyle discourse displaces attention from where it properly lies, which is the spiritual, not the material. The delusional futility of seeking material solutions to the problem ought to provoke an attempt to shift from material life hacks to spiritual activism, at the individual level. An honest recognition of the hopelessness of incremental lifestyle fixes can point at our best, and only, realistic source of hope, which is in addressing our own spiritual motivations and aims, starting now. A fresh spate of Laeth's Aphorisms. Bruce Charlton. Selected from the current iteration of Laeth's blog, Trees and Triads.
The ease with which those of above-average intelligence are manipulated into unfounded and dumbfounded optimism is a confirmation of my pessimism. And there isn't even pleasure, or pride, or fun in being right when the ruse is so obvious. Any sufficiently serious optimism is indistinguishable from brain damage. Never trust a man who proudly owns a smart car. Hoping for the best is the primary sign that one is in fact a pessimist. Otherwise, what need does one have of hope? Many cannot fathom that there is such a thing as supernatural evil and that it has no master plan beyond defilement and destruction. A willful blindness. Love is when every single one of your particles becomes quantum entangled with her particles. Do you want to be quantum entangled with me? This is how I propose to my wife.
Paganism and Christianity. William Wildblood. I have a good deal of sympathy for serious seekers who wish to explore spiritual traditions of the past because they see these as unaffected by the plagues of modernity to which all religions which have made it into the 21st century have succumbed. Christ is universal and his person and teaching encompass and override everything else, but certain things were undoubtedly lost in official Christianity. God was removed to a far distance, the world became dead matter, the gods were demonized, which means nature lost her sacred qualities, and the universal supplanted the local with spiritually sterilizing results. To a certain extent, an involvement with paganism can restore these losses. But only to a certain extent. The difficulty here is we are modern people living in the modern world with modern consciousness, and needing to learn lessons associated with all those things. We are not our ancestors and not meant to return to their way of life and mode of being, even though we have lost many good things of those times and to our great detriment. We should certainly be aware of that loss and try to restore it, but we have to do so in a way that is natural to us, that becomes us, and ancient pagan rites, rituals and beliefs will always be like a suit of clothes we have borrowed that do not really fit us. Furthermore, the spiritual approach of the pagan path lacks something that makes Christianity uniquely powerful. Paganism has its gods who may still exist in some form, either angelic or demonic, on the inner planes, and who may also have lived in the physical world in prehistory, but it does not have the incarnation of God. There is no spiritual figure in any religion other than Christianity who manifested perfection, no Odin, no Zeus, no Apollo, no Athene, no Isis etc. begins to do this, and this matters because the religious exemplar determines the mindset of the followers. This is not to say Christians are better people than those of other religious backgrounds, but the pattern to which they seek to conform themselves is on a higher plane of reality. It is the true and original template of truth compared to which all others are only approximations at one or several removes. In the standard Christian view, God and creation are separate, which means that we, as part of creation, can only achieve divine union through grace. The pagan approach is to see the world as an emanation of the divine, which gives it a sacred quality often lacking in the ex nihilo scenario. However, there is an important strand in Christian mysticism summed up in the saying of Meister Eckhart that there is something uncreated in the human soul which we may take to refer to the spark of divine being that is the source of our life. Without this always present spark of divine being, an eventual union would not be possible. To be created in the image of God carries the same meaning as does the idea that we are the sons and daughters of God. The child is born from the seed of the Father, and that is the Spirit within us. This does not mean that we already are God because the spark is in the soul, it is not the soul itself, which means that the created part, the soul, has to transcend itself to know its real and eternal nature as divine, and that is the goal of all spiritual life. This scenario satisfies both the need for grace and the doctrine that God already exists within us as our innermost being, so it takes the pagan idea of divine immanence up to a Christian level where it can be properly sanctified. Creation may be ex nihilo, but that only means there is no pre-existing stuff out of which God creates. It does not preclude the possibility that he creates out of himself, and that idea would resolve the conflict between the creationist and emanationist schemata. Pagans might reject Christianity because they see it as removing God from the world and even from the soul, but they, in turn, miss that both the world and the soul are in their present state fallen, and that deep wound can only be healed by and in Christ. Too much individuality, not enough personality. Francis Berger. One insight from Laeth that I have found particularly clarifying when it comes to the problem of what it means to be oneself, to be true to oneself, is the distinction between individualism and personality. To simplify Laeth's often overly complicated and circular line of thinking, I will reduce his definitions of the two to the following. Individual? A human being possesses both individuality and personality. Laeth defines individuality as the exteriorized, natural, societal aspects of human beings. Within this conceptualization, nature and society form the whole, and the individual forms the singular part of the whole. In other words, the individual is a part of nature and society, not vice versa. In this sense, the individual is largely an external phenomenon determined almost entirely by external forces, the enslaving power of the world. The individual is not the existential center, it is the perceived base component of an existential center that exists outside the individual, an existential center with which the individual must comply or struggle against. The individual is an object among objects. The object world determines an individual's worth by evaluating the individual's objectness. In this regard, the individual is impersonal. Personality. Birdemic-Peck defines personality as the absolute existential center. Personality determines itself from within, from the inward scheme of existence, which Birdemic-Peck equates with spirit and freedom. Unlike the individual, a personality is not a part of the cosmos is a part of personality. Personality is the quality of the cosmos. Man is a personality not through nature or society but through spirit and freedom. Personality is not an object among other objects and not a thing among other things. It is a subject among subjects, and the turning of it into an object or a thing means death. Personality contains not only a human image but also the image of God. Personality is not an object but a subject. It relates only to other subjects. God communicates with personality, not the individual, because unlike the individual, personality has the capacity to be truly free and engage in self-existent, original, creative acts. As a being, man is both an individual and a personality, but through an enslaved form of consciousness, man focuses far too much awareness and energy on the former, at the expense of the latter. Consciousness determines being, and man is locked in a mode of consciousness that convinces him that his true self exists primarily, or in extreme cases exclusively, only in the individual, that is, at the level of an object among objects. This mode of consciousness has made man a slave to the world and a slave to himself. The solution to this enslavement involves shifting consciousness from the individual to personality. Individuals define themselves by their relations with society, nature, and the world. Personality defines itself by its relation to God, from which it draws the strength and unity needed to overcome fear and determination. Final participation needs to aim at participation in divine creation, not the world. Bruce Charlton. It has often been recognized that modern man is alienated from life, feels cut off by his consciousness from both the divine and from the spirit world. A desire to alleviate this alienation is behind a lot of spiritual activity, and many of the spiritual movements of the past couple of centuries. The problem was incisively analyzed by Rudolf Steiner and Owen Barfield. Both were clear that we should not, and indeed could not effectively, go back to earlier modes of unalienated consciousness. Instead we need, and must, unless we are not to suffer spiritual death and self-chosen damnation, to move forward to a new kind of integration with the divine and the spirit world, this desired state Barfield termed final participation. Named on the basis that participation in the world is the opposite of alienation from it. Steiner believed, or, at least, asserted, that final participation could be attained by spiritual exercises in a new kind of meditative practice, and made schemes of such training, but after a century of near-total failure, it is reasonable to conclude that such techniques/methods/training don't work, or don't work well enough to make a significant difference. I think the reason that final participation cannot be achieved by such procedures is partly that FP must be part of a Christian life and operate in that context. Christianity is necessary, and must come first. A fact sometimes apparently denied, and often backgrounded or downplayed by Steiner and Barfield, certainly it was not clearly explained in terms of God's motivations. And also that this kind of participating consciousness requires to be motivated by love. And love cannot be attained by techniques, nor can it be had simply by deciding. It is false to try and make ourselves love this or that, or everything. Therefore, final participation needs to begin from actual love, and build from that. I now strikes me that this also makes sense from the perspective of what exactly is that final participation should desire to participate in. We should not, as Christians, desire to participate in the world, not the entirety of reality, because this includes evil. The attempt to participate in everything is not Christian, but part of oneness spirituality, which has a very different aim than salvation. Instead, we should aim to participate in divine creation. That is, we should aim to participate in that of this world, and only that, which is a product of love. Not try to participate in the whole world, but to align myself with divine creation. I find this insight to be clarifying. Whether the insight will lead to greater success in my seeking of final participation remains to be seen. Note added. To clarify, those who wish to participate in the world, the whole world, do so on the basis that all is one, and the distinction between good and evil is illusory because this mortal world is illusory. I would have thought it fairly obvious that this is not what Christians believe, despite that many who call themselves Christian espouse it. Christians should, surely, believe that evil is real, not illusory. Although, in this mortal life, we cannot help but be involved in evil, this ought to be discerned, and repented. So it does not make sense to have an ideal participating in everything that goes on in this world. Our hope is to be resurrected to eternal life in heaven, where everything may be participated, because all derives from love. Charity equals strategic evil, and this applies to all charities, whatever they call themselves. Bruce Charlton. Nowhere has the convergence of institutions into a single strategic program of totalitarian, bureaucratic evil, been more evident than among charities. I've just had inflicted on me, by YouTube, an advertisement for the organization that calls itself Christian Aid. The C word is nowadays in lowercase and forced into the background of the logo. Their globalist, totalitarian perspective is encompassed by their mission statement: Christian Aid exists to create a world where everyone can live a full life, free from poverty. Which was, after all, Christ's main message. Well, maybe. And their #1 current campaign, linked with the satanic-themed Paris Olympics, is join the race to beat the climate crisis. You get the pun on race. And the inbuilt assumption that there actually exists a thing called the climate crisis, which is the #1 threat to the world today, and is specifically the primary cause of poverty. And that climate is a thing that can, and should, be beaten. But my point is that all charities of any size, increasingly even very small and local ones, are the same in this regard. It does not matter what their name is, what they were founded to do, or what they pretend is their core concern. The bottom line is that all charities really do is global totalitarian leftism, and therefore, there are no Christian charities. Whatever may be claimed otherwise, all charities have Satan as both patron and chief executive. Christians should not react to the desecration of Christian art and symbols. Francis Berger. I have a deep appreciation for most Christian art and symbolism, however, I do not allow this appreciation to cloud my understanding that all Christian art and symbolism are exteriorized objects, secondary realities that may represent, reveal, or reflect primary reality yet are not primary reality in and of themselves. A significant part of the spiritual morass we find ourselves in stems from confusing secondary representations of reality with primary reality. We are slaves of symbolized reality. We live our lives imprisoned in this secondary unreal reality. Society itself is a symbol and not a primary reality. The system controls virtually all symbols, and it endeavors to convince us that its symbol society is the primary reality. When the system desecrates Christian art and symbolism via the mass media, it trashes the exteriorized objects of Christianity, nothing more. The primary reality of Christianity is immune to such degradations. Yet, Christians react to the system's profane perversions of Christian art and symbols as direct attacks against the primary reality of Christianity. The system accomplishes two goals here. 1. It keeps Christians locked in secondary thinking when they should be striving for primary thinking. 2. It keeps Christians in a reactive state of being when they should aim for a creative state of being. The individual Christian can do nothing to stop the system's desecration of Christian art and symbolism. However, he can attain inward freedom and creativity from the system's sacrilege by recognizing the core spiritual motivations behind the glaring inversion and irreverence. Adam and Eve are the microcosmic equivalents of spirit and matter. William Wildblood. Eve was born from Adam's side as he lay in deep sleep, just as matter is born from unmanifest spirit. In the pre-creation state, spirit and matter are one, but this does not mean there was unexpressed spirit and unexpressed matter. All was spirit, which then projected forth matter as its reflection, or that in which it may see itself, in the dualistic world. Duality means the bifurcation of subject and object, and is necessary for creation to come about, since pure oneness is being empty of form and therefore unknowable existence. God is conceived of as masculine because he is spirit, all spirit before manifestation, and the spirit polarity once manifestation has occurred. In terms of creation, the masculine is the active and the feminine that which is acted upon, as the logos imprints form on substance, but from their union arises the soul, which is the evolving consciousness. This whole universe and space itself is the body of the mother. The life in the universe is from the father, and time is the movement that drives the process of growth. Here feminine space represents the field of being, and masculine time that of becoming. So again we have the active and passive poles operating together, though we must remember that passive does not mean empty or without quality, as it is the fecund ground of potentia. Who would have thought that the sexual act and its fruits contain the clue as to how the universe came into being? On the other hand, why would this not be so? The greater is reflected in the lesser, and the same principles operate throughout creation. This is one way we can enter into the mind of God. By seeing how he acts in the world, we can start to know him. It is said that God is unknowable. That is not true. He is in us and we are in him, and he is very knowable, but he is not fully knowable. His being is inexhaustible, and there will always be more to discover, but we can start on the journey of knowing him here and now. Daydreaming of paradise. For it to be real, we would need to change ourselves, as well as our environment. Bruce Charlton. I suppose many people daydream about some idyllic, pastoral kind of paradise, and when we are young, perhaps we believe it may potentially be attainable on this earth, and during mortal life. Over the years I have had several such daydreams, including the Shire, and Lothlorien from Middle-earth, being a married writer with kids in a rural retreat among friends, and a particular era in Concord, New England at the time of Emerson and Thoreau. Such daydreams have a fuzzy quality, are often little more than a snapshot, or a particular mood state, and are utterly detached from the practicalities and realities of the situation, such as how it might arise, and how it could be sustained. As I have said before, paradise implies not only an ideal place, but ourselves changed such that we would be able to enjoy it. I could not experience the Shire as in my daydream unless I was also a hobbit, nor Lothlorien unless an elf, not Concord, c. 1840 unless I was a man of that time, place and class. In another sense, we would have to become a better person, better in the sense of better fitted to the daydream, and when young we tend to assume that this can and will happen. But anyone who is realistic and honest soon realizes that this doesn't happen. We change, yes, but we don't really get better overall. Even when we eliminate some besetting sin, or some horrible antisocial trait, this always comes at a negative cost. That cost may be necessary, and worth paying, but there will always be a significant cost. In his exegesis, after listing 24 ways in which he has been changed and improved by his religious experiences of February and March 1974, and writing some year and a half later, Philip K. Dick concluded, from page 226 onward.
The only problem is, I am in no customary sense, maybe in no sense whatsoever, spiritualized or exalted. In fact, I seem even more mean and irascible than before. True, I do not hit anybody, but my language remains gungy and I am crabby and domineering. My personality defects are unaltered. In the accepted sense, I am not a better person. I may be healthier, maybe not that, vide the blood pressure. But I am not a good person, even though my emotions and moods are better under control. Maybe I just have a long way to go.
In the end, if we pursue this to its conclusion, we will realize that paradise can only be post-mortal, and that any paradise that does not entail the retention of our ultimate selves is not a paradise at all, because it would be somebody else enjoying it, yet the ultimate selves must positively and qualitatively be transformed, in a way that never truly happens in our experience or knowledge of this world. What if the Olympics opening ceremony had been reverent and pro-Christian? What then? Francis Berger. I ask all Christians who were so shocked by the blasphemous spectacle of the opening ceremony of the Olympics that they immediately took their blogs to write scathing posts lambasting the establishment and its demonic system to pause and consider the following points. What else did you expect the Olympics opening ceremony to be? Does it matter how, why, or to what degree demons and the demonically affiliated desecrate Christian art, themes, and symbols via the mass media? Isn't this getting a bit stale at this point? I mean, how can you honestly be shocked by anything the demons and demonically affiliated do to Christian art, symbols, etc.? Have you ever paused to consider that your vehement, outraged reactions might be what the demons and the demonically affiliated are aiming for? How would you have reacted if the opening ceremony had been uber-religious, reverent, and packed with pro-Christian themes, symbols, language, imagery, slogans, and messages? Concerning the last question, I offer the following speculation. Here's what you would have done. You would have taken to your blogs and written posts eulogizing the organizers for their piety, reverence, and devotion. You would have written post after post praising all the symbols and language, and drone crosses, the organizers broadcast. You would have inferred that the reverent Christian symbols and language signaled the beginning of a great and long overdue mass awakening. You would have been brimming with optimism, overflowing with joy, and bubbling with expectation. Perhaps you would have gone as far as to discern the hand of God at work within the operation. And you would have done all that because you remain stuck in symbol and secondary thinking. The criticism of the sacrilegious display and the hypothetical lauding of the fantasy Christian themed opening both miss the mark because they are locked in the realm of secondary thinking, the unreal level of the symbol. Christians have two options here. They can continue operating exclusively at the level of the symbol and secondary thinking and be little more than the perpetual playthings of demons and the demonically affiliated, i.e., reactive, manipulable, distractible push-button automatons. Or they can begin dedicating themselves to the level of primary thinking and direct knowing where they can start working creatively with God, beyond the reach of all demons and the demonically affiliated. Note added, I didn't watch the opening ceremonies. Why would I? Depth in life doesn't come from regarding it as symbolic of something else, but from conviction of purpose and resurrection. Bruce Charlton. I believe that the symbols through which people used to relate to Christian reality have all but lost their power, but, whether or not you agree, the public and shared world of symbols has now been taken over, trivialized, subverted and inverted, by the totalitarian mainstream of government, media and institutions. If we are not to live consciously futile lives, then we need to know life as deeper than the mundane surfaces with which we are bombarded 24/7. The depth of life goes deeper than perceptions and emotional responses, because it entails knowing, believing, that there is purpose to life, which knowing there is purpose to the universe, to reality. And of course, this purpose must be something we regard as good, to which we personally wish to affiliate our best efforts. But beyond purpose, if the depth of life is to be robust to its ills, we also need to know that we, ourselves, will continue eternally beyond death. If not for this personal and everlasting life, then the evils and entropy of the world will, sooner or later, destroy everything we value, everything that gives present life its purpose. We will get sick and ill and die, so will those we love, and all that we most value in our societies and communities, and nature itself will change, degenerate, dissolve. We therefore need a purpose which we personally endorse and that extends into forever. Such is the basis that may underpin a solid sense of depth in life. 1. Destruction really is much easier than creation. 2. Destruction is what they are aiming at. Bruce Charlton. I know, I've said it all before, but people really need to grasp what is going on in the world of geopolitics and global strategy. People need to grasp what is the core aim of the top-level leadership of those who control the major Western nations and the international/multinational groups, such as the UN, WHO etc., EU, and NATO. That aim is destruction. But that isn't enough. People need to grasp that destruction is easy, much easier than positive creation. I regard this as a profound insight into our reality. As mortal men, we live in a material world where entropy is at work everywhere, and death has the last word. In this world, order must be continually rebuilt against the tendency towards chaos. Creation is continually being dismantled, even while it is being created. Those who seek to destroy have innumerable options, while those who wish to create do not. Only a minority of trained and competent people, with much time and effort, can make a piece of complex machinery, but any destructive fool can wreck it. Indeed, the destructive fool can, and does, use complex and intricate technical creations to wreck each other, thereby increasing the rate of destruction, as happens in war. Actually, because entropy never sleeps, complex and functional stuff, including humans, animals, plants, needs constant and appropriate maintenance, so that creation can be destroyed without effort, simply by neglect. So when we analyze the two sides in war, or politics, or anywhere, and when these two sides correspond to good and evil, to creative and destructive strategies, then we will find that the good side will move relatively slowly, and is often forced into a reactive stance, across a wide range. In contrast, the side of evil has so many options and such an easy job because they are working with entropy and chaos. The people, the beings I should say, who are trying to destroy England, have scores of lines of simultaneous attack, that are pursued 24/7, and via multinational and national politics, the mass media, and all the major institutions. Internationally, wars are provoked, sustained and escalated by bribing and blackmailing the leadership class. Meanwhile these same nations are being internally destroyed. Because destruction is the aim and destruction is easy, they are, in effect, simultaneously crippling and poisoning the people of the world, while getting them to fight each other to the death. Okay, but it should be asked, if evil is aimed at and easy, then why hasn't the world already collapsed and everybody died? The short is that until recently the ruling classes were not aiming at destruction. They were aiming at various things. Some relatively few had good and creative aims. Others wanted evil, yet not primarily destructive, things, such as conquest, wealth, personal power and so forth. Until recently those with most power and wealth were not intending generalized destruction. But they are now. If not all of them, but mainly those in the West and multinational institutions, yet given the relative easiness of destruction, they will win. If only because for them everyone losing is what they regard as winning. Therefore, even though led by the one genius among the global leadership class, and with a far more strongly motivated, because genuinely Christian, country, the Fire Nation cannot truly win the current war so long as the Sorothic Western leadership class, they, remain in power. For them, every defeat of anybody is a victory, all destruction is a triumph. And they can and will keep it going for as long as they are in a position to do so, which is, until they are physically removed, and the epidemic spiritual infection of totalitarian secular leftism that they have released and promoted, has been decisively rejected. Since they are so powerful, dedicated to destruction, and destruction is easy, the only way they can be held back and defeated, temporarily, would be if their evil destructiveness was opposed by sufficient positive creation, such that they were substantially removed from power. I see no sign of this at all. The masses are not as bad as their leadership class, but the mass of men utterly lack the motivations needed for positive creative good. Therefore, as things stand, as the odds are stacked, the powers of destruction will prevail in this mortal world. To recapitulate, 1. Those with greatest power in the world, now, have the aim of destruction. 2. Destruction is easy. Hence, I regard these as the end times, a qualitative end to this era of the world, of civilization, happening already and unrolling every year/month, week, even despite local, and hard-won, rollbacks of the power of destructive evil and beginnings of new creation. Destructive evil can only be held back by constructive, creative, good, and there just isn't enough of it, or strongly enough of it, to overcome the advantages of destruction, at the large scale. As usual, as always, we are thrown back onto the personal and the spiritual, which is not only the best option, but increasingly the only realistic option. The Birdemic-Peck as a case study in how the agenda of destruction manipulates totalitarian evil into implementing its plans. Bruce Charlton. What follows can be considered a small exemplar of the destructive program of the globalist and Western top leadership class, and how they get the world's middle managers to go along with it. By the world's middle managers, I mean those who most people regard as the ultimate leaders, for example national political and governmental leaders, large corporation leaders, mass media moguls, the executives of all large institutions such as the military and police, science, education, law, the arts, and churches. What these globalist middle managers instruct, in obedience to the real-world leadership class, is then obediently implemented by the administrative myrmidons, that vast class of the professional and managerial middle class who dominate everyday life. So when it comes to global implementation of the Peck, as a supposed response to the Birdemic, we can see how this played out. At the low level of implementation which most people perceive, we saw a united front from public health professionals, doctors and researchers, being referenced as conclusive evidence by politicians, managers and the mass media. Yet there was zero rational case for using the Peck at all, at any level, let alone a multi-billion global level. Why? Because the Peck was unnecessary, ineffective and harmful. In other words, mass pecking should not even have been considered. But if it had been considered honestly, it totally failed to satisfy standard, consensus epidemiological benefit-risk criteria, which I was taught as a public health medic in the early 1990s. So the consensus that global mass pecking was necessary and good was clear evidence that the visible leadership class and their justifiers and implementers was simply obeying orders. Orders which I infer were emanating from the invisible world real leadership class. We need to ask why these personages regarded it as the single major global priority to peck everybody in the world with an agent that could only do net harm. And then a rigorous consideration will lead to the answer that this imperative was destructive in its aim, it could not be otherwise. Whatever the actual outcome of giga-pecking, and given the gross corruption of data collection and science and the media, I don't believe this can accurately be known, the destructive motivation is evident. My point here is that we can understand the global peck campaign as motivated by sorothic destructive evil, but implemented by the harmonic totalitarian believers in a global matrix system of micro-surveillance and omni-control. Thus, the motivators and the implementers of mass pecking each have a different agenda. Therefore, both hyper-organization and general destruction are simultaneously being pursued. Which prevails? At first glance the totalitarians are far more numerous and known, and seem likely to prevail, but that is not the case. Because 1. Destruction and disorder is so much easier than construction and order, and 2. The globalist totalitarians are obedient to the top-level sorothic beings. In practice, as with the peck, the vast apparatus of totalitarianism merely serves to rationalize and implement the agenda of destruction. The totalitarians do what they are told, which includes dishonestly explaining why the peck is not just necessary but safe, not just safe but beneficial. This is how the agenda of destruction is pursued. It applies to the Birdemic itself, and the peck. It applies to the climate stuff, the anti-racism stuff, the feminism and trans agenda, to the Fire Nation and Arrakis wars, indeed to all of the major and long-term policies of the real rulers of this mortal world that I have termed the litmus tests. What's wrong, and right, about collective values as the bottom line validation for our life? Bruce Charlton. It strikes me that most kinds of atheism have some kind of psychology or sociology as the bottom line explanation and justification for judgments of value. Purpose and meaning are regarded as products of humans, and particular judgments regarding values, such as truth, beauty and ethics reach their final explanation in terms of psychological concepts such as the human mind, human instinct, and in terms of collectives or groups of people and their psychology. In other words, when individual psychology seems too diverse and conflicted to rationalize values, for many generations people have reached for collective values to make their bottom line judgments. For instance, when it seems obviously inadequate to relate a prohibition on murder to what is best for or wanted by a single person, it seems natural that when the problem is restated collectively, as what is best for or wanted by some large, or universal, conceptualized of many people, some community, that this is a more objective explanation and justification. Consequently, many of the most influential kinds of atheism have some collective value as their bottom line. Utilitarian philosophy is stated as aiming at the greatest happiness, or utility, of the greatest number. This usually led to economic conceptualizations of society, as with communism and other types of socialism, since the group utility was described and manipulated in terms of statistics about income, wealth, working hours and the like. Nationalism regards the well-being of the collective nation as primary, and the value of individuals of that nation as derivative of the national spirit, so that the individual may be, and should be, when required by the collective nation, sacrificed to the imputed nation, potentially even to the point of near extinction of the individuals of the nation. The kind of public health thinking that, for instance, underpinned the Birdemic response was rationalized on the basis of what was best for the health of the collective, in which health was analyzed and expressed statistically, in terms of measures such as disease numbers and rates, and death numbers and rates. Another example is Jung's collective unconscious, which was conceptualized as a universal group mind, so that what might have been individual experiences, instincts, needs etc. were restated as deriving from a shared, group reality. This was regarded as more spiritual, because such things were not detectable or measurable by perceptual means, nor were there measurements, but instead via qualitative phenomena such as archetypes, and evidence came from interpersonal communications of dreams, myths, artistic productions and the like. But although often regarded as spiritual, the collective unconscious seems to be, in reality, a quasi-biological entity. I wonder why it is seen as too subjective to have individuals as bottom line, whereas it is more objective to have a collective bottom line, despite that the collective is dependent, ultimately, on the individual. It seems, on the face of it, irrational that people seem ready to reject the significance of the individual experience or evaluation, as merely personal and subjective, whereas the same people seem not just willing but more highly motivated to suppose that there is an objective reality, and an imperative value, that we should be guided by it, about the collective. This would hardly be likely if the collective was nothing more than the collecting together and combining of many individuals. Yet this is so, and, apparently spontaneously, we actually do regard group phenomena as, at least potentially, ideally, in some way more objective, more binding on our values. My interpretation is that there is a fundamental underlying truth behind this collective way of thinking, even for those, like communism or healthism, badly distorted by abstraction, which is what lends such systems a degree of motivational effectiveness. There is also an untruth, which is why none of the atheisms have proved sufficiently effective social motivators, none have come close to replacing religion, none have been able strongly to motivate men to acts of courage and self-sacrifice for long-term goals. The consequences we see all around us, in mainstream hedonic nihilism, and the prevalent self-loathing and covert suicidality of Western civilization. In sum, the collective is, in practice, as well as theory, not just a collection of individuals, but what exactly it is, or could be, is distortedly and incompletely formulated by the most influential kind of atheism. Conclusions? I think we have a vague but true sense that we are justified in some kind of groupish and collective way. To some extent this is a mistaken attempt to overcome the nihilistic meaninglessness of atheism, partly by a sleight of hand, and also by a kind of averaging process in the group. Individuals generally change more rapidly than do groups, and individuals usually have a shorter lifespan than groups, so that the sheer lability and instability of individual life is ameliorated by immersing individuals into a conceptualized group. In other words, while collectives are not more objective than individuals, groups seem somewhat more objective, quantitatively, not qualitatively. Compared with a single person, groups are bigger, stronger, wealthier, more powerful, longer lasting. In a sense, this makes groups feel more real. But deeper than this lies the potential of a profound truth about the collective. If the true collective is the totality of divine creation, rather than merely some group of humans, then it would seem that there is a valid and ultimate sense in which a big question about life is whether or not we affiliate ourselves to the collective that is creation, whether we join our individual person to God's creation and God's creative will. By the decision and act that Christians term love, we can choose to put creation above our individual selves, and to derive our values from the totality of ourselves in loving alliance with creation, in a mutual relationship. Mutual because we love God, God loves us. Instead of the relatively greater objectivity of human collectives compared with the individual person, there may be an everlasting and qualitative objectivity of the resurrected individual man, in the wholly divine reality of heaven. Love your enemy relates to inner reaction, not outer action. William Wildblood. Jesus said love your enemy, but he didn't say love the enemy. We need to distinguish between our personal relationships and the broader issue of the fight against evil, in which there is no room for compromise or tolerance or sympathy. That doesn't mean we should hate those who serve the enemy, whether that be consciously or, in many cases, unconsciously, but the enemy is always the enemy. The ideas of the enemy are corrupt and corrupting, and while those who serve the enemy should not be hated, nor should their ideas be given any quarter. One of the weaknesses of contemporary Christianity, a religion which has largely become just a hollow shell, is its belief that it should love its enemy, and that love means you must be nice to your enemy. The enemy will just take advantage of that and ruthlessly exploit it. Jesus told us to be harmless as doves, love your enemy, but also to be as wise as serpents. Love without wisdom is useless because it descends into vapid, ineffective sentimentality which, given the fact that we are in a spiritual war, will just be used against you. And we are in a spiritual war. That fact has never been more obvious. Christians are getting worked up over the depraved corruption of the image of the Last Supper at the Olympics opening ceremony, and so they should. But really, what did you expect? This ceremony has been nakedly satanic for some time. The much-praised one in the UK in 2012 made me feel physically sick when I watched it, which I did only to see how bad it would be. It exceeded my expectations. I haven't seen the recent one except for some still photos, but it is interesting that the attack on Christ, and yes, this is an attack on Christianity, but it is chiefly an attack on Christ, has become more overt. It shows that the enemy no longer hides but is revealing himself. That may mean a greater confidence because the softening up process, which has been going on for more than 2 centuries, has done its job, but it also makes the enemy easier to spot, which makes him weaker. The Olympic ceremony attack was centered on 2 things, which are Christ and human sexuality, or, in other words, God and nature. When you attack nature, you indirectly attack God, who is the author of nature, and when you deform people's minds through this attack, it makes them more susceptible to whatever poison you subsequently wish to inject them with. When you attack Christ, you attack God directly. This has a good claim to be the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, which, we are assured, is the one sin that is not forgiven. And why is that? It is because it is a spiritual sin, not a physical one, lust, gluttony, sloth, nor an emotional one, anger, envy, and nor one of the mind/ego, pride. This is what we saw at the Olympic ceremony in Paris recently, the deliberate blasphemy of fallen created beings against their creator. We are told to love our enemy so we don't fall into the soul-destroying sins of hatred and anger. Thus, this is for our sake, not for the sake of the enemy. Loving your enemy does not mean not recognizing sin as sin or evil as evil, but that is what it is being used to mean. Love your enemy means keep your heart pure and undefiled by hatred, which will put you in the hands of your spiritual enemy. It does not mean refusing to fight that enemy. The instinctual roots of leftism are more like resentment of anyone else having more than me, than any positive desire for equality. Bruce Charlton. Since leftism is the dominant ideology in the world today, and leftism often appeals to some principle of equality, however vague or incoherent, as the rationale for its actions, the instinctual basis for equality is a subject that warrants closer examination. This examination is something I attempted, from the perspective of evolution by natural selection, in an oft-cited theoretical paper I wrote many years ago. The Inequity of Inequality, Egalitarian Instincts and Evolutionary Psychology. Bruce Charlton, Journal of Health Psychology. 1997. My conclusion was that evidence from anthropological studies of simple, nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, i.e. the most economically equal societies ever known, was that their culture of equal sharing, among those of equivalent sex and age, is not due to a positive valuation of equality. Instead, the sharing was a consequence of what I would now term a double negative ethical reasoning, for which I used the term counter-dominance. Equal sharing is enforced upon high-status individuals by spontaneously arising counter-dominant coalitions of lower-status individuals. Sharing may be a way of encouraging cooperation and preventing conflict. It would compensate low-status males for their reduced access to females of high reproductive potential and can be seen as a way of buying off potentially hostile rivals who might otherwise refuse to cooperate or take hostile action. Counter-dominant instincts operate in two ways: firstly to enforce equal sharing of resources, and secondly to be satisfied with an equal distribution of resources. In support of this idea, primatologists such as Byrne, Kummer and de Waal have traced the evolutionary history of food sharing, and of other counter-dominant, and proto-moral, behaviors, through monkeys and apes to reach the highest, non-human, intensity and sophistication among the chimpanzees. Egalitarian human societies are therefore not without their social conflicts. Their harmony is of the nature of a dynamic equilibrium between dominance and counter-dominance, both of which sets of instincts continue to operate, the equilibrium between which can be altered by a change of circumstance. In all human societies, even in egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, the persistence of dominance instincts leads to recurrent attempts by high-status individuals to dominate, take more than an equal share of resources, or hoard. However, in immediate return economies, attempts by high-status individuals to breach the egalitarian distribution and attain coercive power will readily be detected, and can be met by counter-dominant community alliances of lower-status individuals. Counter-dominant alliances may employ a wide range of tactics for mobilizing concerted opposition from the rest of the community in such forms as public complaint, ridicule, threat, ignoring the would-be dominant individual's orders, or actual group violence against dominant individuals. Homicide is not uncommon, and difficult to prevent, in hunter-gatherer societies. Other alternatives include expulsion of recalcitrant individuals, or mass emigration to another band to escape domination. Such strategies are possible due to the lack of sustained power differentials underwritten by resource differentials. In immediate return economies, no one person can become so powerful as to be immune to counter-dominant strategies. But when, as in delayed return economies, high-status individuals can appropriate a greater than equal share of resources, they are able to sustain this inequality by building alliances among high-status individuals, and by enlisting supporters, e.g. a gang or bodyguard, to create larger and more powerful alliances, trading the stored resources as payment for cooperation. In sum, the distribution of valued resources, such as food, tends to be equal, not because equality of everybody is positively valued, but instead because me having less than anyone else is negatively valued. And those who have less, immediately gang up on anyone who has more than them, and compel him to share it out. If counter-dominance is an approximately correct explanation of the instinctual basis for equality, then it readily explains the observed structure and behavior of modern leftist ideology. A close synonym for counter-dominance could be a spontaneous resentment at others having more than oneself, coupled with a tendency to form alliances with others having similar grievances against those who have more. Insofar as this is instinctual, it operates on people and situations in a person's perceived environment, which nowadays includes, and is perhaps dominated by, the virtual environment of mass and social media, reinforced by the real-life social world of gossip and interaction, that so often takes up and amplifies themes from mass/social media. For me, this idea of a double negative, and resentment-based instinct helps explain the incoherence of leftism, in that the left is a collection of people with a collection of grievances, each rooted in the belief that anyone else having anything more of what I want is an unjust state of affairs. It is this instinct which leads to the supposed ethical principle of egalitarianism, that is manipulated by political leaders, in order to control, and weaken, the masses. Because, in a mass modern society, with multiple valued resources, there are many overlapping, hence incompatible, demands for equal sharing among many overlapping groups. there is never any greater equality in modern societies, and indeed this state is logically impossible because incoherent, but there is instead a continual state of resentful complaint about inequality, as predicted by counter-dominance being at the root of it. And this continual state of resentful complaint is positively encouraged and reinforced by, and as, the value system of leftism. From a Christian perspective, we can see that resentment is a sin, indeed the master sin of modernity, and therefore that, insofar as the basis of equality really is counter-dominance, leftism is rooted in evil motivation. An evil motivation that is spontaneous and instinctive, hence powerful. Nonetheless, no matter how natural it may be, all sins are natural. After all, resentment is an evil that ought to be repented and minimized, not celebrated and encouraged. Can anything effective be done to reverse disenchantment? Bruce Charlton. We all probably experience personal disenchantment as a process through our childhood, a transformation of the world from being a magic place of hidden motives and meanings, often sinister and malign, to the mundane materialism of adult and mainstream life. There is also a slower, social trend towards societal disenchantment, that I have both read about and also experienced in my own life. In the 1970s and 80s, even such mundane materialistic bureaucratic systems as schools, universities, hospitals, and many cities, were still touched by a kind of residual enchantment that was spontaneous, often unconscious. And there were then still many people who remembered them as even more magical, and treated them as such, and added to the enchantment thereby. As a romantic by nature, I felt these receding of enchantment in my life, and the world around me, very keenly at the time, and did my best to fight against it by holding on to the residuum, and trying to build from it, but with little and lessening success. I did this because it seemed then, and it seems now, that a mundane world and life, without enchantment, depth, spiritual resonance, in a dead and unconscious universe, is simply not worth living. If life is nothing more than comfort, convenience, amusement, and excitement for the temporarily fortunate, and pain, disability, disease, degeneration, and death for the rest, and everybody, sooner or later, then such a life is a matter of indifference to the mass of mankind, as evidenced by the reluctance to have children, or indeed lift a finger, to defend it. And it seems that, on the whole, the rest of the world agrees with me on the worthless futility of a mundane life, because most people are actively planning or diligently implementing the end of civilization, thus themselves and their loved ones, or are going along with it in a state of denial and idle incomprehension, having no better ideas or ideals. But if clinging to the residuum of enchantment does not work, and since this disenchanted world cannot motivate us to sustain it, then it seems we must seek something else if we are not to fall inevitably into despair. It seems that a viable re-enchantment of the world, to be attempted in some new kind of spirit, from some new kind of understanding, is actually the most important thing in the world. I personally cannot let this subject alone, and when I am not brooding on it in a would-be constructive fashion, I feel as if I am neglecting my most fundamental duty. I have encountered quite a few good ideas about what we ought to be doing towards a genuine, and effective re-enchantment. For examples, I have often referenced the likes of Steiner, Barfield, Arkell, but none of their practical ideas to encourage or create re-enchantment seem to work nowadays, and some seem counterproductive, although they probably did work, to an extent, in their eras. My current conclusion is that the task has now devolved from the group to the individual, so that general plans and schemes, and recommendations of a generalized kind, have apparently ceased to be useful. Since the necessity remains, this may imply that re-enchantment has become the work of the present day, or even hour. We each must start a fresh start from here and now and from our current personal state of being, whenever we become conscious of the need. Very vague, I realize, and maybe yet another ineffective suggestion. But maybe not. Maybe there is little alternative, and maybe that is the way God has made it. We can only do what we ought to do, if we are to do anything at all in the necessary direction. And since God is the Creator, and God loves each of us, we can assume that any small positive good we accomplish, in thought or action, and that is worth it, shall be noticed and amplified by God to ramify throughout His creation. What are the limits of patience? Francis Berger. I have always wondered about the limits of patience. I'm not referring to the varying degrees of patience individuals possess or display, I'm talking about where one should draw the line concerning patience. At what point should one refuse to bear problems, delays, or suffering without becoming irritated about them? Calmness, composure, self-restraint, and forbearance are all admirable qualities, perhaps even virtues, yet at what point do they fail to bear fruit, stop helping spiritually, and become impediments? Jesus reached his limit most dramatically during the cleansing of the temple. Yet, his patience wore thin on many other occasions, albeit far more subtlety. What are the limits of patience in this era of limitless tolerance for everything but the rejection of the litmus test issues? On a more personal level, what are the limits of patience with strangers, friends, and family? When can or should one say enough is enough and give impatience free rein? There is no definite answer to any of the above. Individual results depend heavily on individual circumstances, and inevitably vary. I understand that. Just thinking aloud. Arthur, Merlin or Robin Hood, the greatest British folk hero. And Guinevere. Bruce Charlton. As a kid, I would have said Robin Hood, for sure. This was almost entirely because of the lifestyle aspect. I liked the idea of living in the woods, and off the woods, with a gang of my friends, tracking, bows and arrows, camouflaged clothes etc. Robin Hood was without doubt the premier English folk hero, through the Middle Ages and up until the past couple of generations. If Robin has a real-life origin, he is English. Nowadays, it is Merlin, for sure. But he is not really an English folk hero, being a combination of the Scottish Lailoken and the Welsh Merlin, with, I believe, the Scottish Lailoken being the historical person, and having nothing to do with the historical Arthur, Lailoken being born 2 or 3 generations after the Celtic general. Arthur has always been there, but was never first in my interest. Indeed, I found him a rather lackluster person, in some versions, or a mere warrior, in other versions, and not even the best warrior, either. The historical Arthur is British, i.e. from the time of Celtic England and Wales, but when Scotland was distinct, mostly Pictish. The later Arthur is Norman, or, more exactly, a product of the Franco-English Plantagenet dynasty, and thus concerned with validating and mythologizing their aristocratic obsessions with cavalry, adultery and celibacy. This is why the chivalric knight hero Arthur has tended to be a favorite of the upper classes, while Robin was the people's hero, and Merlin became the collective archetype of the great seer/prophet/magician/sorcerer/wizard, therefore something of a link between the Celts, English, Scots, and Normans. Guinevere, who has never had much of an heroic status, except in the most superficial treatments, has always struck me as even more lackluster and uninteresting than Arthur. But in marrying Arthur she can be regarded as another linking figure, between the ancient British Celts of Cornwall, and the Anglo-French Normans. The failure of that marriage is the spiritual failure of the project of Britain. Guinevere is a sterile, childless beauty, who never does much except get abducted and, apparently, falls in and out of love with various suitors, especially Lancelot. This hints towards a recent idea, elaborated by Wendy Berg, in Red Tree, White Tree, is that Guinevere is a fairy, and thus a link, or intended to be a union, between the world of men and fays. That is why she is fascinating but sterile, and so passive, she is unsuited to the human world. Also why Guinevere keep getting abducted by various, disguised, fairies who are her relatives and suitors from Faerie, trying to get her back. But the Anglo-Norman chivalric Arthur was challenged in my childhood by a more historical Arthur, as the warlord leader of the Roman British Christians against the pagan, savage, barbaric Saxon invaders. This Arthur was propagated widely, via scholarship initially, and later, but not much later, by romantic fiction, TV, movies etc. For May people, this people's hero Arthur has largely displaced both the knights and damsels Arthur, and also Robin Hood, and absorbed Merlin as a kind of druidic figure. Arthur is the new Robin. Thus the national mythology continued to develop and evolve, even in late 20th century, maybe into the 21st century. Britain. What is purpose in life? The God's Eye View. Bruce Charlton. One of the ways in which we are misled and fall prey to temptation, is having a false picture of our core assumptions. For instance, Christians have been led deep into sin and desired damnation, by false pictures of the nature of love, such as regarding love as essentially an emotion. Another potential problem lies in conceptualizing purpose in life. Most Christians would recognize that we need purpose in life, and that purpose is focused on resurrected eternal life in heaven. But what it is to have a purpose, is often unclear or inaccurate. If pressed for an answer, I guess that most people would have a picture of purpose in life as something like a shining lamp, up ahead, towards which they are striving. A vision of where they want to be, and what they want to be doing. The difficulties with such a picture is that it is, again, as with the example of love, very much about emotions. Secondly, it entails a separation of here and now from the goal. It raises all kind of means and ends problems about how we ought to get from here to there, and almost inevitably our actual mortal lives, here and now, start to seem like merely a means to the end of heaven. In other words, we tend to devalue this life, as something we want to get through, get out of the way, over and done with, soon as possible. By this way of thinking, we don't want to be here, earth, we instead want to be there, heaven. And the journey, mortal life, is an annoying delay. But if, as I believe, this mortal life is important, for as long as God sustains it, then this is a mistaken attitude. We are wishing away something that God is sustaining us through, for, no doubt, good reasons. Thus the idea, which I believe true, of mortal life as learning. Yes, mortal life is indeed a temporary, and transitional phase, and considered of itself therefore evanescent. But its learning consequences may be everlasting, may affect of post-mortal life for eternity, especially if we are able to learn those life lessons that God provides for each of us, according to our need and benefit. What all this implies is the need for a picture of, or perhaps a metaphor for, purpose in mortal life, that gives proper value to this life. Also, to be effective, it needs to be the kind of picture that is in practice suitable to motivate modern men, as we actually are. And I mean by this that we cannot any longer depend on spontaneous and unconsciously right understandings. Our situation begins with alienation, cut-offness, most often an assumed materialism. This means that our picture of life's purpose needs to be something consciously chosen, therefore the kind of thing that can be chosen. Negatively, this means our purpose can't depend heavily on emotions, it cannot be underpinned by emotions, because we can't choose to have particular emotions, and we need to be able to continue with our purpose even when, as will surely happen, emotions are adverse. In other words, our purpose needs to be more like an understanding of reality, than like an emotional drive. So, what kind of picture of purpose fits the bill? I think the answer is that the picture should be an assumption. We choose to assume that such and such is true reality. Choosing to assume that the picture is real means various things. Firstly, that we want our world picture to be real, and also that we regard the world picture as really real, at least in essence, if not in detail. Both wanting it and regarding it as true is the combination that makes for motivation. I suppose we could consider the picture as a God's eye view of our mortal life and beyond, by which we see mortal life from the outside, as one part of a larger and more complex scheme. From such a perspective, we can see that the problem with the lamp analogy for purpose in life is that it is a man's eye view, which is why it fails to see properly beyond death, and hastens towards heaven without proper regard for earth. By our eternal natures, we all have the divine within us, however weakly or imperfectly, and it is this innate divinity, if we acknowledge it, which enables us validly to take a God's eye view on things, and to know that the picture is essentially valid. Explaining the intractable stupidity of the masses. Bruce Charlton. There is a meaning of stupid that refers to the inability to take in and understand what is happening, and that is the way in which the masses are stupid in the modern Western world. Intractably stupid. Their inability to learn from repeated experience is apparently infinite. The correct explanation for intractable stupidity is not what is usually put forward. The relevant stupidity has almost nothing to do with propaganda and censorship of information. People can have access to sufficient relevant facts and true enough theories to explain them, but remain utterly stupid, because they cannot generalize from one situation to another, from one day to the next. Anybody who needs every specific situation, every time something happens, re-explaining, is stupid, or, at any rate, stupid in the meaning I'm using here. People, ordinary people, the masses, even servants, serfs and slaves, were not stupid in the past like they are stupid now, despite that they were uneducated, illiterate, and had very little information or explanation. Indeed, their ignorance was an indomitable last line of defense. One difference is that they, in the past, were able and willing to think for themselves, and no matter how ignorant and uneducated they were, this set a limit to how much and how often they could be deceived. There was a very basic, survival-orientated peasant cunning or common sense that stood in the path of the masses accepting anything and everything, when it impinged directly upon their lives and immediate surroundings. And in the past, almost everybody was religious, which meant they had a larger, more coherent and more extended understanding of reality than the modern masses. The meaning of life in the past extended beyond emotions to the divine, whereas for modern man feelings are the bottom line of what we acknowledge to be reality. Including facts, because it is our feelings about a fact that actually decide whether or not a fact is real. As often, mass stupidity cannot be ameliorated by double negative methods. In other words, because error is infinitely expansible, we cannot solve the problem of error by correcting an ever-increasing multiplicity of errors. Falsifying errors, negating negations, is a mug's game, although it provides permanent employment for pundits. The answer is, and must be, simple, positive, coherent. If each among the masses had a positive and coherent idea of what his life was about, where his life was aimed at, if he knew what he positively desired in a permanent, eternal sense, then all possible deceptions would, in principle, sooner or later be detectable in terms of their interference with this life goal. Learning would be possible, because someone who knows where he wants to go and how, can recognize, without needing to be told, who and when others are trying to push him off course. In sum, the modern masses are intractably stupid because they are suffering the mental sickness that is mainstream ideology, those ruling assumptions that include atheism/materialism/leftism. The good news is that this mental sickness is self-chosen, in the sense of being passively consented to and then actively defended against refutation. And that is also the bad news. Evil in the Modern World. William Wildblood. The grip evil currently has on the world is even greater than might appear from its more obvious public manifestations, which are too numerous and too obvious for me to need to go into here. You know what they are. But we must remember that the real aim of evil is not the destruction of nations by mass immigration, nor the debasement of culture by egalitarianism, or the curtailment of freedom by lockdowns, nor even the causing of pain and suffering. Its real goal is the bringing of souls to spiritual damnation, meaning inciting them to reject God. That is what is behind everything else. Some people have the mission to uncover the truth behind particular establishment-pushed lies, and we owe them our gratitude in that they can provide substance to back up our intuitions. Others stand back from the particular and see a more general picture in which the tentacles of evil have spread over every aspect of modern life. They can provide a spiritual framework that can be used to understand the motivations and modus operandi of evil. To see the particulars is important in that we can avoid being sucked in by them, but we must not get too caught up in them. We can waste energy on fighting the enemy's foot soldiers in little side battles when we should really focus on what the generals are up to in the main war. That's the one we should fight, and we should fight it for love of God, not out of hatred and anger against the enemy. That having been said, there is room for righteous anger, even if that should not be the main motivator. Evil always has to be invited in. A situation may be contrived as it was 4 years ago that may encourage capitulation to evil, but still there is always an element of choice. The nature of spiritual reality demands this. Free will always operates. There must be choice, even if we may be manipulated by propaganda and fear in a certain direction. The world's situation is bad and will get worse. But, trite as it may sound, you have nothing to fear if you put your faith in God and align your soul with the Spirit of Christ. The world is burning, but always remember that nothing good, nothing true can ever be lost. In a world of lies, your task is keep your eyes on heaven, hold fast to the truth and proclaim it. If leftism is a religion, then religion is an exclusively exterior force that aims to reduce to nothing. Francis Berger. Many equate leftism with religion, a superficial comparison if there ever was one. If leftism is a religion, then religion is nothing more than socialization and exteriorization. Leftism is leftism because it is exclusively exterior, exterior in its focus, in its aims, assumptions, composition, in its execution, and so-called faith. The explanation for this uber-exteriorization is simple: leftism lacks interiorization. Leftism is all outside because it has no inside. It has no inner being. More precisely, its inner being is non-being. At its most fundamental level, leftism is the ultra-exteriorization of non-being and nothingness, and the only possible end game of projecting non-existence into the world is annihilation. Reflect upon all the classes, nations, groups, movements, politics, economics, individuals, and revolutions leftism supposedly defended and supported in the past. The white male worker ranks among the most obvious of these. What has leftism done to the white male proletariat? What about women? How about its visions of economic equality and its many other glorious, exclusively exterior endeavors? Annihilation all the way down. To annihilate means to reduce to nothing. The overarching goal of all leftism is to reduce everything and everyone to nothing. A force that aims to reduce everything and everyone to nothing can hardly be called religion. Religion, real religion, not entirely exteriorized, predominantly ceremonial and societal religion, is elementally interior. It is rooted in freedom and being. It exteriorizes much of this freedom and being, primarily through language and symbols. However, such exteriorizations do not form the bedrock of religion, they only reflect and represent it. The reflections and representations of religion in the external world are the cooled byproducts of a primary internal awareness and force that ultimately seeks to create. The yearning to create is, or should be, a central driving force of the religion people refer to as Christianity. Unlike Leftism, which seeks only to reduce being to nothing, Christianity aims to increase and expand freedom and being, not merely within the confines of mortal life in this world but from the perspective of eternity.